Welcome, gentle reader. Thank you for being with us today for another wonderful episode of Everything is Everything. Amit bhai, how do we wow them today?
How do you know it's going to be wonderful? Your confidence is exceptional. So, a couple of episodes ago, we mentioned a couple of themes. We used the phrase victimless crimes, and we also spoke about people hooking up in Ashoka. So, someone wrote in asking, what do you mean by victimless crimes? What is a victimless crime? Doesn't every crime have a victim and all that? And I have actually written many pieces in the past about how the state should not punish victimless crimes. And I figured, hey, let's do an episode on it because I found that thinking about it gave me a lot of clarity both on ethical matters and on the role and the limits of the state. So I'd like to start by defining what we mean by victimless crimes. First of all, what is a crime? In the popular imagination, if you break the law, that is a crime, right? And that is legalistically correct. But the larger question that lies behind it is that what does the law consider a crime, right? We should not automatically assume that whatever is illegal is necessarily wrong from an ethical perspective. What does the law consider a crime? And the way that I think about criminality is the way that I kind of think about liberalism, that all of us have rights and our rights apply only insofar as we do not infringe another person's rights, right? So for me, a crime is when you're infringing someone's rights or you're harming them in any way, which is infringing rights. So for example, you have a right to life. If I kill you, that would be wrong. I'm infringing your right. That's murder, right? That's outlawed, correctly so. Equally, you have property. If I steal from you, then I am infringing your right to property and therefore that should be a crime. That's perfectly fine. So criminality, I mean, the whole purpose of the state is to make sure that individuals don't infringe the rights of other individuals. That's where the laws come in, and the laws are meant to punish exactly that. What has happened over time though is that there is a whole class of laws that essentially outlaw what one would call victimless crimes. Victimless because you're not infringing anyone's rights. You're just doing something that harms no one else, and yet the state deems it illegal. And most of the time the state will deem it illegal because it has that central planning mindset, not that we don't just have to protect people's rights, but we have to engineer society to our wishes. If something is considered immoral by us, we must outlaw it, right? And if we want a desired outcome, then we tweak the laws like an engineer does until we get those desired outcomes. And we outlaw things which are not actually harming individuals. And I have a huge problem with this. So in this episode, I want to talk about, different kinds of victimless crimes and the different consequences of, making them illegal in the first place. Like I should point out in the phrase victimless crimes that in my definition of crimes, they're not crimes at all because there is no victim. If there is a crime, there must be a victim. So please note that when I talk of victimless crimes, they're not crimes. It's just a term used in the law for things outlawed by the state that do not actually, infringe anyone's rights.
So you're going to show us one field after another and show us the victimless crime and the kind of mess that arises when the government tries to get into it.
Precisely. But first, in our next chapter, I want to get a little broad and talk about why banning victimless crimes is a problem to begin with.
Okay, let's start at the principle. What is wrong with the government going after its chosen shortlist of victimless crimes?
So there are three things that are wrong with it. Number one is based on the moral principle that I know both you and I agree with, that consenting adults should be free to associate with each other in any way they deem please, whether it is in the bedroom, the marketplace, or the public square. Right? I'm defending all of those domains there, and both of us kind of agree with that. And when the state steps in here and says that no, it appears to be only your business, but it's my business also. I will decide what you do with your body. I will decide how you two interact with each other. I will decide what you may or may not say to each other. To me, that is a huge problem. So my first objection is a moral one, that when the state takes it upon itself to kind of interfere with the private choices of people, the voluntary interactions of people that harm no one else, everything goes to hell. And all of this, we will illustrate all of these three objections. Objection number two is a practical objection, that when you ban a victimless victimless crime, you're not ending the demand for whatever that thing is. So the underworld springs up in its place. And when the underworld springs up, there is no control on behavior, coercion comes in, fraud comes in. And I will give concrete examples of this in, some of the subjects we are talking about, like alcohol and prohibition, like prostitution, like gambling. I mean, all of these cases, wherever you ban a victimless crime, the underworld immediately comes up and things become much worse, and you don't get the desired outcome either, right? That is my second objection. My third principled objection is that we should care very deeply about how much power we give the state and for what reasons. Again, something you and I have discussed a lot, that we are giving the state a monopoly on coercion. It is unfortunate, but we are doing it because there is no choice. We need someone to have the monopoly on coercion to protect our rights and to maintain rule of law, which is basically what protecting our rights means, and so on and so forth. So it is unavoidable. But we should not think of it as a given that the state exists first and we are there to serve it. It is the other way around. And therefore, I am suspicious of any power that the state has, and we need to question it at all times. If you start giving the state arbitrary powers to refashion society, the state will do so according to its own values, which will depend on the times, which will depend on the party in power. Another example of a victimless crime being banned is homosexuality, which until recently was effectively illegal in India, right? Now, these are the mores of an earlier, darker time being applied to society, and it is completely unfair, and it destroys lives, and it must not be, allowed to happen. Now, thankfully, it took many decades, but finally, homosexuality is legal in India. But otherwise, in any domain where the state tries to engineer society, things go wrong, and you might have certain values, and then you will say, hey, the state should, pass laws according to my values. But the point is, a person you hate most in the world could be in power tomorrow, and they'll pass laws according to their values. It is better to keep the state out of all of these personal domains entirely and not give it too much power. So, gentle readers, I would like to begin this chapter by informing you an ethic that I learned from Ajay, in fact. Ajay does not drink. He has never had alcohol in his life. He is completely against it for very good reasons. I had an episode with the liver doctor, Abby Phillips, on The Seen and the Unseen, where he made an important point about alcohol. He said that even an occasional glass of alcohol is bad for you. People will often say that, oh, a glass of wine is good for the heart or whatever. But his point was, it may well be that a glass of wine is, good for the heart in a particular way, but the damage it causes the liver is far more, so you should just avoid it. So I personally might drink once or twice a year if I'm with friends and it's that kind of hot summer day and you're having a beer, but otherwise I have abjured it completely. However, you made a personal choice. I made a personal choice. Not everyone should be forced to make a personal choice, and our views on alcohol may well be wrong. 20 years later, we might find it's not so bad either. So we should not force our views on others. Now, the logic for banning alcohol, for prohibition, is that, hey, it's bad for society, right? In India, in particular, lower class men will get drunk, upper class men will get drunk, men will get drunk and beat their wives, and they'll commit crimes, and they'll do all kinds of things. And, the logic, therefore, of banning alcohol, of prohibition, is simply that we are making society a better place. We are protecting those battered wives who are beaten by drunkard husbands. We are protecting those men from themselves. This is the logic. It's a fine intention, but you're not going to get to the outcome that you want to get to in this manner. We have typically seen a number of things happening with prohibition. One is that it never stops the problem. People simply keep drinking. And the reason it never stops the problem is, my second argument, which is that the underworld will always come in. There is a great essay by the regulatory economist Bruce Yandel called The Baptist and the Bootlegger. And his point is this. His point is that there will be a Baptist who will stand on high and give moral grounds for banning alcohol, that it is ethically wrong. And there will then, after alcohol is banned, be the bootlegger who will then, give you underworld supplies of lower quality, unregulated alcohol in a marketplace where a lot is going wrong. So you'll hear stories of hooch poisoning and so on and so forth. And, all of that is unregulated. And it will simply happen because there is that broad social demand for it. So what do you do? It's going to happen. And in fact, the Baptist and the bootlegger is an important concept which the film Rais got completely wrong. Right, in Rais, what they show is that the Shah Rukh Khan's character plays a bootlegger, and there is a Baptist kind of goody-goody politician coming to town arguing that alcohol should be banned, and Shah Rukh Khan tries to stop him. And this makes no sense, because typically they are in cahoots. Their incentives are exactly aligned. The Baptist wants alcohol banned so he can do his virtue signaling, and the bootlegger wants alcohol banned so he can make money on the black market. So even if they're not like explicitly hand in glove, they're working towards the same purposes. So this is a case for prohibition that, one, it doesn't work. So even if you leave aside the moral level of moral argument of what I want to drink, I should drink, the point is that it simply doesn't work. There is no point. And throughout human history, prohibition has never worked anywhere. I have had alcohol in Gujarat, I have had alcohol in Lahore when I was visiting Pakistan, where also there is prohibition, and yet there was a flourishing black market for alcohol and drugs, which I entirely support, because they should never have been banned in the first place. I might not partake of them, but other people have agency, and if they wish to do so, that's the way it is.
I will defend unto death your right to say certain things and do certain things. I just want to add to this in some small ways. In the field of alcohol and drugs, and I know you're going to come to drugs to a greater extent, the economists have a very interesting measure, which is what is the black market price. So the extent to which the government is able to successfully enforce shows up as a price premium. And this is interesting from both sides of the coin. The weird equilibrating problem is that suppose there is a very large price premium, then in fact you get great entry by the criminal underworld, because you're telling them, wow, you can make tons of money by doing this. So it's ironical that on one hand, the measure of successful enforcement is that the price of the forbidden substances should be high. But that very fact, high prices of illegal alcohol or illegal drugs, kicks off greater energy by private people to engage in entry strategies. So it's a really unfortunate story that if you try to go after this and you even succeed in the short term, you're only stoking greater effort and greater organizational capacity in the long run. The second idea in this field is that you talked about criminality. I want to bring in the words organizational capability. Okay, so you can always do crime as a lone ranger, like you can be a solo creator and you can run some crimes. Okay, but your ability to do anything on a large scale will be more limited. And then you can build firms, you can build complexity, and you can build real capability where large teams of people are able to collaborate and engage in more complex criminal activity. We saw this clearly in India, where the barriers on imports created smuggling, and smuggling became a giant business. And the great Haji Mastan gangs and so on were created out of the world of smuggling. And when we create these kind of laws, we foster the development of organizational capability in the underworld, which is not good for all of us. It is better for us to have lone rangers and solo creators in the world of crime.
And import duty is actually a fantastic example I hadn't thought of. It could be a chapter on its own, but since you bring it up, import duties are actually punishing a victimless crime. What is a crime? I buy something in America, I bring it here and I sell it to a friend. And immediately it is a crime because I haven't paid the hafta to the state, which brings up another point, that typically what happens is that if the state bans something and an underworld springs up, the state is going to use leverage to get hafta. They're going to get payments from the underworld, as low-level police would routinely do during the smuggling days, the golden era of smuggling, as it were. And equally, you are going to catch someone who is breaking the law by indulging in that victimless crime and take hafta from them. And when state capacity is as weak as in India and policemen are badly paid, this is bound to happen. I'm not painting with too wide a brush. I think fundamentally people who work in law enforcement are excellent people. Perhaps I am biased because I've seen the Bombay police up close and no other police, and they're super efficient and they're good citizens. But the incentives are what they are, and this is the way it has played out in our history.
So Amit, alcohol, okay, you could still say a relatively easy problem, okay, and what would I know? Okay, I have never partaken, but what about hard drugs? Is there a line there? Again, what would I know? I've never partaken. Are drugs way more dangerous than alcohol? I have read things like you do one shot of cocaine and you are instantly addicted. So are these substances qualitatively different? And then in recent years, all over the world, for example, we're seeing legalization of marijuana happening on a large scale. So how should we think about that complex of issues?
So I have smoked up only once in my life, which was circa 1995, with a friend of mine called Amit Saigal. And a great world famous guitarist I won't name because it'll seem like too much of a humble brag, but he happened to be visiting India, and the three of us were in a car, and I was in the back seat, and I was early 20s, and they were like, "Do you want to smoke up?" And I felt nothing. But anyway, regardless of personal experience, I don't. I think hard drugs take us to a thorny area like cocaine. But as far as marijuana, grass, etc. are concerned, and I won't even know all the different names and what they precisely mean, the fact is that they are less harmful than alcohol. They are less harmful than cigarettes in terms of long-term damage, and they are far, 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 far less harmful than sugar. And I would in fact say that even sugar should not be banned, but they're far less harmful than all of those. So number one, there is a moral argument that even with a hard drug like cocaine, you could say that, hey, I want to do it, what's the problem? Number two, there is the argument that don't paint in strokes that are too broad. That cocaine is one thing and dangerous hard drugs are one thing, but you have recreational drugs like LSD or marijuana, which are actually fine, which are not that bad at all, which have been used openly and recreationally and without harm for vast periods of time in human history, and therefore they should not be banned. The third argument is again then the underworld comes up. Now you look at what has happened in America's war on drugs, where a disproportionate amount of police resources have gone in fighting the war on drugs, and there is an opportunity cost to that. That policing isn't somewhere else. Secondly, it has created this culture of criminality, much as all of the Bombay underworld came up because of what import duties did in terms of incentives and building the smuggling business. Similarly, all of the incentives of the war on drugs have created this vast underworld. They have disproportionately affected less privileged members of society like the African American community, who are also overrepresented in prisons, for example. So the social impact has been really harsh, and you haven't really stopped drug use at all. There are places where drugs are actually legal, especially marijuana and so on, large parts of Europe. And then the thing is that just the same way that we, regulate medicine or regulate health food or whatever, you can do that kind of stuff. The competition itself among legitimate players who are not struggling to stay afloat will be the best regulation and ensure that you have good quality mal going to the market, as it were. And there have been no adverse consequences. There have been arguments for a long time that if the state wants to spend resources in a public health kind of way, in the sense that you think about addiction as a problem, you think about the root causes, you go into all of those areas and you mitigate the harms that you can do, but you don't interfere with people's individual agency, and you also don't allow the underworld to take over as it has.
So I think about this as what mothers do, that I would sell to moms that please think hard and understand this landscape so you can talk to your kids. And, as you said, I'm a person that has been on zero alcohol, zero drugs all my life. I don't recommend it to others, but these are things that people should think about and choose. And this should be the conversations between moms and their kids, or it should be a public health issue. And as you correctly say, hey, sugar is a public health issue. Okay, so it isn't as if the world does not have many, many harmful chemicals that harm you in various ways, and we need to think about the shades of gray of which chemical should be treated in what fashion. But it seems very troubling to bring the state into this.
And sugar is actually a great example. We did an episode on diabetes, how I reversed my diabetes, where type 2 diabetes, where we laid out the history. And the history basically is that sugar is the root cause of many, 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 many bad things in the world. In fact, some are even referring to Alzheimer's as type 3 diabetes. Sugar is the root cause of so many terrible things. And yet, for decades, especially in America, sugar was given a clean sheet and fat was demonized. And part of the reason, as we outlined in that episode, and gentle listener, check that out, as we outlined in that episode, part of the reason for that was that the sugar lobby spent a huge ton of money on buying researchers from Harvard and elsewhere who came out with these influential studies with bad methodology, which essentially mistook correlation for causation and said fat is a problem, sugar is completely fine. And I would not say that today we know the opposite is true, but I would not say that we should ban sugar. I would instead say that the government should have no role in it whatsoever. What happened in 1977 was the top dietary body in the US came out with dietary guidelines where it said that sugar is fine and fat is evil. And if you look at a chart of the obesity epidemic, that is really when it absolutely explodes, because everybody follows those guidelines. They're having junk food full of processed sugar, and they're avoiding good fats, and everything kind of goes to hell. So I would just say that the state needs to stay out. That is a classic example of a time when the state intervened because it thought it would do something that is good for society, but its knowledge was not good enough, and the matter should just have been left to individuals to decide.
Okay, Amit, we've done alcohol, we've done drugs. How should we think about gambling?
Let's talk about gambling. Now, I was a professional poker player for 5 years. The poker is, on the one hand, I would say that poker is a game of skill, it's not pure gambling. But on the other hand, I would say what's wrong with gambling, right? So first, I want to make a broad point. And the point I want to make is that we are all gamblers. Every moment of our lives, we are gambling. The very fact that wonderful Pi was on your lap just now, in a sense, it was a gamble putting him there. What if he disrupts a shoot? But then you considered the probability of Pi's disrupting the shoot and the damage it would cause with the probability of the notion that he would enhance the shoot and make it better, and the probability that, of the joy that you would get and the oxytocin flooding through you and the consequent ways in which it would enhance your thinking. You take that and you make, and obviously you're not consciously thinking of all of these things. But my point is, everything in life is gambling. You go and talk to a girl in a bar, it's a gamble. There are probabilities attached. You choose to marry someone, it's a gamble. You choose this job instead of that job, it's a gamble. There are probabilities everywhere. You're making a decision based on some intuitive notion. Most of the time it's intuitive, you're not thinking it through. Based on some intuitive notion of where the chips may fall. Right? And sometimes it's wishful thinking and sometimes things go wrong. But everything is a gamble. Some things obviously are like you buy a house, who knows what will happen in the neighborhood? Will there be floods? Or who knows what your neighbors will be like? Any stock market investment is obviously a pure gamble in that sense. So if you define gambling as weighing up certain probabilities and making a bet based on your best judgment and your Bayesian thinking on what's going to happen, everything we do is gambling, and we should not necessarily stigmatize certain forms of gambling. Though I must point out that in all my years as a poker player, I've been in casinos a lot. I have never played a game against a house. Not even once have I put a single rupee on a roulette table. It's just not my thing, because it is a losing proposition. You could say in a sense I was gambling by not putting money there because I was weighing up the probabilities. So number one, I want to destigmatize gambling and say that we are all gamblers, we are gambling all the time. Number two, the underworld problem. That when you ban gambling, immediately the underworld comes in. And I think of this because I was a cricket journalist for many, many years, right? Match fixing was a scourge in our times, right? And people conflate the two. People will often conflate betting and match fixing. And I will say, boss, are completely different things. Why is match fixing happening? Match fixing is happening because betting is illegal. So the underworld comes in. And when the underworld comes in, they are outside the purview of the law. Nobody is looking at their money flows and etc. etc. And therefore, they are incentivized to do all kinds of shady things, and match fixing obviously comes to mind, right? I would say today it should probably be much less than it is because players get paid much more, so the incentives have changed. But regardless of that, the shady shit happens when the underworld is there. Imagine a universe where cricket betting and other kinds of gambling is happening in the open through respectable institutions. Just as we have a demat account to invest in shares, HDFC or IDFC could offer you accounts which you open, which you use for gambling, right? And what happens there? They are respectable institutions. They have certain processes already built in. There is institutional memory of all of that. They are relatively easy to regulate, though I would say any regulation should be severely light touch only to avoid fraud and match fixing and things like this. But they're easy to do that because everything is in the open. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, right? But you drive it underground, you have all of this shit happening, and people are going to gamble anyway, and people are going to bet anyway. And I completely get the argument that people get addicted to gambling, they lose all their money, terrible things happen. I feel this viscerally. right? Because in my years as a poker player, and I've written columns on this, which we'll link in the show notes, I have seen gambling addiction destroy lives. It is like drug addiction and alcohol addiction. The same argument can apply. In the case of people close to me, I have tried to make interventions and I have failed because addiction is addiction. However, the state can't do anything here. Social problems have to at some level be solved by society. The state should know its limits. If the state tries to step in, things become far worse and everything goes south very quickly.
How do we think about the boundaries when it comes to prostitution?
You know, the moment the word prostitution comes into our head, all kinds of unpleasant images come into our head, especially in India, where you think of women being coerced into the profession and, shady brothels and dark streets and all kinds of terrible activity happening. And prostitution in Europe would have a completely different connotation, for example. And the first thing I want to do is I want to destigmatize prostitution, right? What are you and I doing? In a sense, you and I are doing the same thing as a sex worker does, right? We are good at certain things. We are selling our services. I might be a writer or a podcaster. You are an economist. You can give advice on things, right? We are selling our services to people who value those services. A carpenter is selling his services. A plumber is selling her services. And similarly, a prostitute is also selling her services. So you look at it as, except when there is coercion involved, and I'll come to that. But when it's voluntary, she is selling her services to a client, and we should not pass ethical judgment on what that is. As long as there is agency, as long as it is a voluntary decision, it is something that is no business of ours. Whether we approve or disapprove or whatever, we have no right in interfering someone's right to make those decisions. This other thing to realize, and we often say this in the context of other unpleasant jobs like sweatshops or working in a factory or whatever, is that you have to realize that the people who have made the choices to work in those places have chosen that because it is the best option open to them, right? So if someone has chosen, and I pick the word chosen again, but if someone has chosen to be a prostitute, they have done so because it is the best option open to them, and now it is up to you to contemplate how bad the other options must be. Or perhaps they are completely okay with it, and that's also fine. Like, one of my favorite accounts on Twitter is by this lady called Ayla, who is a sex worker who's also incredible at data. She carries large scale surveys and does all kinds of funky things. I mean, her newsletter is actually one of the few newsletters I've paid $100 a year for, because it's so packed with insight about gender relations. And she's a sex worker and quite open about it. And she organized a gangbang for herself on her birthday and all of that. Entirely consensual, and she's perfectly happy doing it. And she's got great arguments and essays about this. So we'll link to some of that. Now, what happens when you drive it underground is where all the terrible things happen, where the coercion comes in, right? You drive it underground. Now, this is a basic human primal demand. It will happen. The underworld will come in. And when the underworld comes in, then coercion will happen. Then there will be trafficking. Then women will be abducted and raped, and all of those terrible things which are happening outside of the sunlight, as it were. Because it is not legal, you can't regulate that stuff. You can't think about the worker rights of the women who work for brothels. You can't think about what their healthcare is like. Everything is underground. Everything is dark, right? And the police gets into the game, because the police has power. It is so common for police to take hafta. It is not an uncommon story that if a prostitute goes to the police to complain about something, she'll be raped by the policeman, right? It's a very dark, seedy sort of business here. And a lot of the coercion is enabled and caused by the fact that we've outlawed a certain kind of solicitation, not prostitution per se, but it's effectively illegal in India. And therefore, the underworld comes in and, it takes over completely. And in a lot of Europe, it simply isn't like that. In a lot of Europe, it is legal, it is respectable, it is legit, and that is indeed as it should be. And in India, there is a fundamental problem which I want to point you to. Like, how do we define prostitution? This is how the Oxford Dictionary defines it: the practice or occupation of engaging in sexual activity with someone for payment. And this is how India's law describes it. The India's Immoral Traffic Prevention Act defines it as the sexual exploitation or abuse of persons for commercial purposes. Right? So India's law, the way it defines it is different from the rest of the world. It takes consent out of the equation. It is exploitation or abuse. And this is so short-sighted. Of course, exploitation and abuse should be outlawed. and the state has to act when there is coercion involved. But that's not what prostitution means. You're conflating prostitution and trafficking for the purposes of prostitution. So really, if you think about it, the best thing you could do is just legalize completely, allow organizations to set up brothels. I don't think HDFC or IDFC will do it, but you get what I'm saying. You bring it over the ground, and then by all means have regulation. Though again, I'd have the state regulating with a light touch, not a heavy touch. But by all means, then regulate sunlight being the best disinfectant, and so on and so forth, and destigmatize the women who choose this. Like to this day, it is considered a pejorative to call someone a whore. Like, which of us is not a whore in some way or the other if you use the term in that manner? So I object to this as well. It is incredibly disrespectful of the women who make these choices. And as far as the women who do not make these choices, who are coerced into it, are concerned, as far as they are concerned, the best way to avoid that is don't let an underworld bring up about it. Keep it overground, keep an eye.
So, Amit, in this field, the great pillar of reasoning surrounds homosexuality. It is a place where there was a time when governments were solidly going after people, and we look back at that time and we think, what the hell were you guys thinking? And in fact, that casts a light on all the other four things that you've talked about today. Take us through a little more of that sense of the journey around how human societies fixed themselves on this question.
So for many, many years, this is a subject I would write about once in a while, column lik diya, blog post lik liya, that decriminalize homosexuality. At that time, Article 370 was in force, homosexuality was effectively illegal. It was horrible. And now, thankfully, it's gone, right? Which shows that, things move slowly, but they do move, but it should never have been there in the first place. Now, two consequences of what the law did. And one is a personal and tragic consequence, where every homosexual in the country would automatically feel that he was in a sense illegal, that he could not express, he or she, they could not express their deepest desires, and they had to hide behind that veil. Many of them were made to feel guilt for no reason at all. There is a social guilt because of the social approbation and disapproval and all of that, but then there is also the sort of the validation of that guilt by the state saying you are doing something wrong, you are breaking the law. And so many lives have been destroyed. So many, we speak of using Thoreau's famous line, people living lives of quiet desperation. That desperation is so much worse for someone who can't even express their sexuality or find love or have to pretend to be someone they are not. So that is a great tragic story, and hopefully in modern times that is gradually diminishing, and the law going away is a great reason for that. But there's another thing that used to happen, which is an illustration of what happens when the state bans a victimless crime, which was extortion. So many years ago, our friend Vikram Doctor had pointed me to this great racket that was happening in Matunga, and I wrote a column in Mint about it, I think 15-16 years ago, called the Matunga racket, right? And here's what would happen. There would be these classifieds websites. Back then, you didn't have Grindr, Tinder and all that, obviously, circa 2007-8. So you would have these classified websites where people would, advertise, where they would say things like looking for a lover, looking for friendship, etc., etc., and gay people would use those to hook up. So there was a particular thing the police used to do where they would advertise on that pretending to be someone looking for love, and then they would call a person to Matunga station. They would say, let us meet at Matunga station, and then we can have some coffee and chat. And this person would come to Matunga station, and then the cops would nab him, right? And then the cops would nab him, and then they'd extort money. And they'll say, look, we'll tell your parents or your wife or whatever the case may be. Sometimes in some cases, Doc told me that they would take the person inside an ATM, take his card and just empty everything. And this guy can't do anything because it is almost a primal shame that he has been made to feel, right? And to me, this is not a bunch of bad cops. To me, this is the incentives, this is the nature of the state. Why are you outlawing something that is natural to all of us, that infringes no one's rights, that is voluntary? And then this shame that has been constructed by society and the state, you're using it to extort money from this person. And, it's just terrible. It's heartbreaking and it's horrible. And thankfully, it's some of it is in the past. Because 370 is gone, the Matunga racket is not possible anymore. But it used to happen, and you see how it played out in the context of homosexuality, but the same phenomenon can play out in absolutely any context. Police can raid your house in a state where there is prohibition and find half a bottle of whiskey and, drag you away from it. And that's monstrous.
Amit, let's go back to drug addiction. There is a point at which it really becomes self-harming, as you described with gambling. And how do you think about situations where people are really destroying themselves? Is there some role for the state there when people are truly near a highway to destruction?
There are a number of ways of looking at it. First of all, the highways to destruction that drugs and alcohol and gambling may represent are ways in which a person destroys themselves without really meaning to. They simply can't help it. And that happens. And we've discussed all the things that can go wrong when the state tries to interfere with that. Those people have the agency to do to themselves whatever they may want. Now, let me go back to rights for a moment, right? And come up with this puzzle of modern times. When John Locke came up with the conception of rights, the core right that Locke spoke of was the right to self-ownership. Obviously, I come into this earth, it is not that I am the property of the state or the property of anybody, but I am my own property, I own myself. And according to Locke, and all of modern liberalism emanates from this, all rights emanate from that right to self-ownership, the right to life, the right to free speech, the right to property, etc., etc. Right? All the rights that matter emanate from that right to self-ownership. Now, it would therefore apply that if I own myself and I have the right to life, I also have the right to end my life. My body is my body. I decide what to do with it. So for a moment, leave aside these highways to hell, which are not intended by the person to be highways to hell. Let's think about suicide. Like, I believe in India, I'm not sure what the status is, but certainly when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, suicide was illegal. It was the one crime for which you got punished if you failed to commit it. And it was illegal. And that never made any sense, right? Now, suicide at one level is a terrible social problem. We have a society where mental health is not spoken about enough. If anyone you know has suicidal feelings, you should take it seriously and not ignore the signs and talk to them and get them help and get them counseling, etc., etc. No doubt about that. Equally, for a rational person, it remains every person's right to off themselves. For example, and I think about this sometimes, like, in what situation would I off myself? If I had a terminal disease and I was going to die after a few months and it would be very painful, and a large chunk of my savings would be destroyed during that time, leaving little else for my family, and I was causing pain and distress to those around me, then I might think that the honorable way is just go quietly. Don't fight this.
Euthanasia.
Euthanasia, basically.
Which is a first class debate all over the world, that all of us need to think more about ideas, concepts, principles, institutions around euthanasia.
Around euthanasia, and again, if euthanasia is legal in a place with low state capacity like India, then people will misuse it and they will kill their elders to get their property, and that kind of shit will happen. So state capacity, which I know is a subject we'll come back to later, is a big factor in that. But just to continue with this chapter, therefore, this becomes a question that even outside the context of euthanasia, like, if I want to off myself, I own myself, my reasons are no business of the state. And therefore I feel that suicide should really be decriminalized everywhere. It is a social problem. If your friend wants to off themselves, it is your duty as a friend, if you want to call yourself a friend, to help them out of that dark place, right? At the same time, it is my right to off myself if I want to, and no one else has a right to kind of interfere with that, certainly not coercively as the state might. And euthanasia is sort of one case, and there are places in the world where you can actually go, and there are companies which will sell packages, and you can buy that package and you can choose to off yourself. I think I read a news story a while back about a couple from India who did that somewhere in Europe, I think Switzerland or wherever it is. But there's a company which sells you a package and they will euthanize you peacefully, surrounded by your loved ones, going in a way that you want. And even there are debates that, do you have to have a fatal disease? How do you decide that someone's disease justifies it? Let's not get into those debates. But I just wanted to bring it up, as all of us believe something that I think largely I understand why, that suicide is wrong and we must stop it. But should the state stop it? Should it criminalize it? That is a useful question to ask.
And how should we think about hate speech?
So I'm a free speech absolutist, right? For me, speech is only a problem when there is a direct incitement to harm, right? So if you tell someone, "Jaake Amit ko maro," that's clearly wrong, but it is wrong because you said Amit ko maro, and the maroing is the crime in question. You're inciting an actual crime, and therefore it's part of that crime. But otherwise, you cannot clamp down on free speech, and that includes even hate speech. Like I was at a literary festival recently with an MP who has brought out a bill against hate speech on platforms, and I said, look, I get the intent, it's very beautiful, but I've been writing about free speech for 25 years, and let me tell you something. Laws against hate speech will always be used against free speech, right? Always and everywhere the state will use anti-free speech laws to attack dissenters. It has happened throughout history, it has happened throughout our history. We have laws against free speech which are putatively there for good reasons, 295A, 153A, don't spread religious discord, etc., etc. But they can be interpreted in various ways, and therefore anybody can be locked up according to interpretations. And therefore I'm really wary of it, that at one level intention to fine. Like, of course, I believe there should be no hate speech, right? We should all live a life of love and happiness and goodwill and kindness. We should, right? And some people do hate speech, and hate speech is bad. But should you give the state the power to outlaw it? Because the moment you do, it is going to be used to crack down on free speech and on people like us. So, Ajay, for this chapter, I want to move away from victimless crimes and talk about ethical problems for a moment. In 2003, I read news that got me thinking a lot about ethics and consent and crimes and so on and so forth. And this is a story about cannibalism, right? There's a city in Germany called Rothenburg, and there was a guy there called Armin Meiwes. And Armin Meiwes was a 42-year-old man. His neighbors called him normal in every way, friendly, cheerful, etc., etc. Except there was one thing about him that was unusual, that he had always wanted to eat another human being. Right? So even from the time he was young, from the time he was 8, he had fantasized about eating other human beings. His mother died at one point, and for some reason this urge grew stronger and stronger. But obviously he's a good law-abiding citizen, so he was not actually going to kill someone or eat them. And he was not going to go and dig up bodies and do it. So it was one of those urges which you can't explain why the urge is there, but you kind of keep it to yourself and you don't act upon it. Then at the age of 42, he advertised in a somewhere, I think a local newspaper or a website or whatever, for a well-built young man who wanted to be eaten. And he got a response from a guy called Bernard Brandes, right? And Bernard Brandes, who lived in some other city, said that I've always fantasized about being eaten. So Bernard Brandes went and met Armin Meiwes, and they sort of did this deal where Brandes consented to being eaten and killed, and his body stored and being eaten over many days. And all of this took place on camera. In fact, most of the later events were on camera, so no one can dispute that Brandes consented. He consented at every stage of the way, right? Here are how the events unfolded. First, Brandes took 20 sleeping tablets and a bottle of schnapps, and Meiwes cut off his, probably have to beep this word, but Meiwes cut off his and then prepared it for him, and they ate it together, or Brandes watched while Meiwes ate it. Then Brandes went and took a bath, and while he was showering, Meiwes sat and read a Star Trek novel. And then Brandes came back. And the way the rest of it concluded was that Meiwes cut Brandes's throat with a big cleaver and basically killed him. But on camera, and Brandes consents to this, at least he consents on camera. Then he stored his body in a freezer, and over a period of days, he eventually ate it with olive oil and garlic. I don't know why there was no salt. Perhaps a human flesh has natural salt like bacon does. I don't know those details, and this happened. And when it was uncovered, it created a big stir. And this is absolutely crazy. You and I will respond to it by saying, like, goosebumps, like, what the hell is this? This is nuts, right? These people are crazy. Number one, were rights infringed is a question that you would ask. And the consent on all sides of the equation is clear. And also, cannibalism is not a crime in Germany. Number
But
two,
is murder a crime?
murder a crime, but is it murder? So number two, the question emerges that what if Brandes was mentally ill? Is a person who consents to be killed and eaten, is he mentally ill? And therefore, can you say that he could not,
Incapable of consent.
incapable of consent, right? That is the second question. Even if you assume that he is incapable of consent, do you then turn to Meiwes and say that insanity, make a plea of insanity, because no sane person would want to do something like this, which is again something you and I would agree with, and therefore is a quote unquote crime excusable. And this is a very interesting example to think about our moral intuitions and when punishment should come in. And this is almost a clear-cut case where it seems that both these people must be insane by some kind of legal definition. But there are many cases where it is not so clear-cut, and there is a continuum between sanity and insanity. Who gets to define sanity and insanity? Where do you draw the line? How do you interpret it? All of these come into play. And this is also what I would classically call an icky problem. Many years back, when I was reading about ethics, I came across the notion of icky problems in ethics. Have you heard that term? So let me bring up two thought experiments for you, right? In one thought experiment, I have bought a chicken and I am going to kill it and eat it, right? All legit so far. But before I kill it and eat it, I have sex with the chicken. Is it wrong? Right? So our instinct is to say that, oh my God, this is perverted. Of course it is wrong, right? Example one. Example two, there are two adult siblings, a brother and a sister, who decide to have sex with each other, and they're not going to have kids. Adult siblings are just going to have sex with each other, and they have sex with each other. Is it wrong? And again, instinctively, we just say, it's wrong. And remember, they're not having kids, so the inbreeding issues of children and all don't come up. But instinctively, we feel wrong. And these are what in ethics are called icky problems. That our instinctive, our moral instinct is to say this is wrong. But when you step back and you think about it a little bit rationally, then you have to ask, why is it wrong? You have bought a chicken, it is yours. You are going to kill it and eat it anyway, and we've agreed that's fine. If you have sex with it before you kill it, what is wrong? Why is it wrong? Right? And there's no good answer to that. Similarly, if two consenting adults want to have sex with each other, if they are brother and sister and they're not procreating, avoiding problems of the next generation, then why is it wrong? And that why has no answer, because rationally it is not wrong, but our moral instincts take us in another direction. And my point of telling these two thought experiments in that one story about the cannibalism is simply to point out that ethics are deeply complicated, right? We have ethical instincts, if one may call it that, which arise for reasons of prehistoric programming which we don't fully understand and are not rational. So therefore, when someone who is in power, when someone who controls the levers of the state or a dominant social group in society says that we feel this is wrong and therefore we should outlaw it, there is all the more reason to be suspicious that we don't even understand morality fully. And therefore, when you talk of outlawing something, you want to draw the lines carefully. And you want to draw the lines, the way I would draw the lines is, are you infringing someone's rights? Are you causing harm? If so, outlaw it. And that debate always has to be there. That why? Why do you want to outlaw a person fucking his own chicken, for example, right? And so these are very thorny issues, and the state is a supremely blunt instrument given to bad incentives, which anyway fails in most of its objectives, especially when you're banning victimless crimes. So we need to think long and hard about this. So Ajay, to wrap it up, I'd love to hear your views on this. And just to sum up my views, I feel that there are two reasons not to ban victimless crimes, which are not crimes at all. We're just calling them that, victimless crimes. And the two reasons are, number one, there is a moral reason that if consenting adults want to interact with each other in whatever way, the state has no business getting in their way. Once it starts doing so, everything goes to hell. The second is a practical reason that has two prongs to it. And one prong is that you can't stop these anyway. That prohibition has never stopped alcohol consumption. If anything, it's in fact, it can even go up, right, and make the problem worse, because the underworld always gets in, and then everything goes to hell. You can't regulate it. Terrible things happen. Coercion happens, etc., etc. So that's kind of my practical reason there. That if you give the state so much arbitrary power, it is always and always going to be misused. What are your thoughts on this?
I want to bring three ideas into this discussion. The first is the idea that state capability is a huge bottleneck. You have emphasized it again and again, but I just want to come at it with an additional set of perspectives. Let's start at the first world. Okay, there is an amazing fact that, roughly speaking, 5% of the people who are executed by the state are later believed to be innocent. Okay, so just ponder this, that you have taken the highest punishment, the death penalty, implemented in advanced economies, in the best state capability of the whole world. And there, 1 in 20 is actually innocent, and the state went and caught the wrong guy or did some horrible things, and somehow, even though judges in first world countries are going to ask for the highest level of evidence before ever awarding a death penalty, 1 in 20 was actually innocent. Now, this should really make us think, because under Indian conditions, what do you think is the fail rate of the state? So, all of us should be very skeptical of convictions. When somebody in India is convicted by the criminal justice system, you got to ask yourself, what's the probability this person was actually framed or was actually innocent and just something went very badly wrong. So I don't know estimates of what would happen in India, but large numbers of innocent people are put into the slammer by the Indian state, and we should bring skepticism about the working of the state. And this is an important perspective that we should bring to victimless crimes, that really, do you want to go after the population using such a flawed instrument in your hands? That the Indian criminal justice system is no great shakes, and when it goes after private people wielding a variety of powers, often draconian, then it will give us unintended consequences. Okay, the second state capability way of thinking about it is from Kelkar and Shah. The idea is to think about state capability as a finite budget. You do not have infinite state capability. In fact, we have very little state capability. The essence of being India is we are a third world country, we are a poor country, and state capability is very finite. And when you have very little capability, the wise thing to do is to focus that capability on a few primordial and important problems, and don't scatter it over doing all kinds of things at inefficiently low levels of intensity where we will get nothing done. Okay, so the trade-offs are different if you are Sweden, the trade-offs are different if you are the UK, because the state capability is high, and then you could choose to splurge state capability, and they can and should have complex political debates about what are wise uses of state power. But when you come to India, we have a teensy-weensy amount of state capability. So we should be frugal about it. We should squander it on a few primordial, big, important things. And really, in everything else, we should let go, that it is better to just be unregulated, and this is not the problem of the state. We face a 50 or 100-year journey to learning how to do some basics. Okay, so learn how to do defense, learn how to do monetary policy, learn how to do criminal justice system, learn how to do financial regulation, learn how to build a tax system. That's 100 years of work is cut out for us. None of this is going to happen quickly. State capability emerges very slowly. And then don't take on more than you can chew. That under optimistic assumptions, we have 50 or 100 years of work to do to build the basics of the Indian state. Finally, I want to be thoughtful about means and ends. So if you start thinking that drunk husbands beat up women, okay, and it's a catastrophe for the life of the woman, and you and I are the most passionate feminists in India, and we get that misery like few people do, and we are totally aligned that you want to do something purposive in the world that will get there. But then you got to think intelligently that what are my levers, how would we go about doing it? And I would argue that one of the most important ways to make progress with mistreated wives in India is no fault divorce. It should become easy and frictionless for a person to walk away from a marriage, that there should be no questions asked. And as is done in all advanced economies, the wealth created by the family in the time that they were together should be split at the time of divorce. So it should be easy and frictionless to get a divorce, and the person leaving should get half of the jointly created wealth. And all these things should be simple and codified, and you need the institution building to do it. Now what this will do, this will increase the power of people to walk away. So every battered spouse, every abused spouse is a person who is trapped by Indian law that makes it difficult, that gives the other person a choke point on interfering with your life, and there's really no systematic concept around sharing the wealth created in the period that you were together. So I think this is the way to think about these problems, that find genuinely effective pathways to pursue rather than going all moralistic about it, that think deeply, be grounded in the humanities and the social sciences. So just an emotional outrage is the surest way of getting to a wrong answer. And similarly, always and always, I will say the greatest instrument for the emancipation and the status of women is 8% GDP growth. If you care about women in India, you should sign up for the growth project. Okay, every person who cares deeply about women in India should be a participant of Indian economic growth. Okay, please see the EIE episode which is called Why Freedom Matters. Please see the EIE episode about how to do development. Okay, and you've got to sign on to these journeys of economic development, because by doing these bleeding heart things, we're just getting nothing done.
So I want to say a number of things. I agree with everything you said. I want to say a number of things. One is that economic growth is the best way out for every marginalized group, not just women. You can do all kinds of other signaling, but ultimately when individuals are empowered with the financial ability to walk away from bad situations, that is what, gets them out of those terrible situations. That is what empowers them. I had done an episode a few years ago of The Seen and the Unseen with Nidhi Gupta, Devika Kher and Hamsini Hariharan, called Metrics of Empowerment, where I got these three, outstanding scholars to talk about what metrics, interesting intuitive metrics can we use to figure out, how women are getting empowered, how that is proceeding. And they came up with many innovative metrics. You can look at that episode for yourself and see what they came up with. But my starting point was a metric that occurred to me as something that many people would disagree with, which is divorce rates. For me, high divorce rates are fantastic. The fact that divorce rates are rising is incredible, because it means more and more women are getting empowered to walk out of bad marriages and bad situations, right? And we should celebrate that. And this is also a classic example of how, an old-fashioned society could have the value that no, marriages are forever, divorce should not be in the vocabulary, and they could try to use state power to make it difficult to get divorces and so on and so forth. And that would be very wrong. And those mores in large parts of the world have changed. I came across this amusing thread recently on Twitter about somebody ranting about 5 things that Ronald Reagan got wrong, right? And as I was reading through them, I realized that he got all of them right. And one of them was a no-fault divorce, right? That Ronald Reagan actually made no-fault divorce rates happen, and America's divorce rates went up. So all these conservative traditional types are like, oh, marriage is good and this is a work of the devil, and etc., etc. But oh my God, was it good for women, right? It is a really big deal there. So I agree with you that the way out of this is really empowering the disempowered people. If a woman is getting beaten up by her drunk husband, the answer is, banning alcohol won't get you anywhere, but empowering the woman so she can tell the man to fuck off and change his incentives, and if he doesn't behave, then she can walk away. That is what we should look at doing. And as far as state capacity is concerned, the point is that the Indian state does too many things badly, it should do a few things well. But even of those many things that it does badly, victimless crime shouldn't be part of that anyway. A private interaction that you and I have is not in the purview of the state. Don't waste time on that. So it's not even like we are saying the state should not waste time on some crimes. We are saying these are not crimes. Therefore, kindly stay away. Kindly do your job. Look at how unsafe women are in India. Kindly do something about that. The rule of law, except for the privileged like us, Ajay, the rule of law does not exist in India. And even for us, it might exist because we know people, right? Get that right first. Get that basic shit right first. And I would say that even if after you get it right, don't try to engineer society according to your values. Let individuals be free.
So Amit, we are at the end of the show. I want to recommend to you, gentle reader, a person and a story. And that person is Alan Turing. Okay, he's just one of the great heroes of world history. He played a critical part in cracking the German Enigma encryption machines, which was absolutely vital for the West, for the Allies to win the Second World War. And he was the first theoretical computer scientist. Before there were computers, he was dreaming and imagining what are computers. Now, this is a person who basically had his life destroyed because he fell afoul of old British laws about homosexuality. And when you read that, you just feel so horrible that here was one of the best people in the world whose life was cut short because of horrendous state coercion on purely private matters. So I would just recommend to everybody that just take interest in Alan Turing and study his life and think about it. It will reshape your moral calculus, it will reshape the way you think about the world. And for this entire victimless crimes debate, I think of homosexuality or no fault divorce as being the beginnings of the stirring of liberal values in this field. That these are places where people woke up and said, how dare you, like just let's get the government out of it, with great success, and it has done the world a ton of good. And then once you're willing to accept that mainstream conventional thinking was completely wrong on these questions, then I think we owe it to ourselves to blow oxygen on the spark of doubt in our hearts about the other things that we accept as conventional wisdom and the organization of state power today. That maybe we should not be so sure about using state power in the context of drugs as well.
And the story of Turing to me is deeply moving, not just because he was a great man who was unfairly treated, but because of, why he was unfairly treated. This is not just a story of Alan Turing. In a sense, it's a story of all homosexuals for most of human history, that you are treated as something abnormal, and sometimes the state outlaws you, sometimes the state doesn't outlaw you, but society looks at you in a particular way. And it's only in the last few decades that things have gotten, somewhat better. And this is one dimension across which people suffer, and this is one dimension across which people suppress their feelings and their identities. And in many other ways, we are still unfree, and the state is still in the way. And the beginning of, how to think about ending this is at least get the state out of it to begin with. Let's have that principle that the coercive power of the state should never get in the way of individuals, even if you regard their actions as unethical, right? And once you take care of that, then hopefully society gradually evolves.